Naturally, Muslims need to be ready with their iman and always in a state of iman, but especially the hard times that we're living in now. And I repeat again, as I repeated before, anything we said in the past relating to Imam al-Mahdi radiallahu anhu, it's according to the teachings of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, not the teachings of anyone else. Inshallah, I want to focus today specifically for the rest of the khutbah, with the will and the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on the subject of Iman. Because many Muslims, they get confused between Aqidah and Iman. And a lot of Muslims think that Aqidah is Iman and Iman is Aqidah. We spoke about Aqidah before. But just to wrap up, or just to put a simple sentence to the understanding and the definition of Aqidah, the knowledge of Aqidah, which you find in the books and you get taught by the scholars, etc. The knowledge of Aqidah is something that is given to you to understand and to comprehend and to be convinced with. So Aqidah is relating to knowledge and understanding and being convinced with something. So we haven't yet got to the state of Iman. We haven't yet spoken about the right condition of a Muslim in terms of their Iman and in terms of their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We haven't got to that yet. Even though Aqidah speaks about this. But I'm not talking now about the knowledge. When I talk about Iman, I'm talking about the condition. When I'm talking about Aqidah, I'm talking about the knowledge, the information, the understanding, the acceptance, the convincing. Obviously we don't need much convincing, because when we say there is Allah, it's enough for us to say قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Finish. But when I say convincing, we're talking about non-Muslims more than Muslims. So Aqidah is related to knowledge and convincing, and Iman is the outcome of the Aqidah. And we'll come to that shortly, inshallah. But one thing I want to focus on is a few verses that talk about how Iman should not be, or how Iman is not. Because a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, they tend to observe Iman, and they think that Iman is something completely different to what Iman is. And I gave an example a few khutbahs ago, and I spoke about the danger of not understanding the proper understanding of Iman. Because if you don't have the right understanding of Iman, and you continue living the rest of your religious life or your practicing life in the way that you think Iman is, then you may be in a very dangerous situation, not only on the Day of Judgment, but in your qabr, when you're asked the 3 questions in your qabr: who is your Lord? Who is the man that has been sent to you, alayhi salatu wasalam, and what is your religion? And by the way, answering these questions is not a Q&A session, like in this dunya. It's not someone asking you a question, if you know the knowledge, you answer. No. The answer will be based on your condition, not on your knowledge. So already you can see that we're starting to make a separation between what is Aqidah and what is Iman. When you're in your qabr, you'll be asked the 3 questions. Anyone can answer the 3 questions if we're talking about the Aqidah. Because if I get any non-Muslim to go to any Islamic bookshop, pick up Al-Aqidah Tahawiyya in English and read what is Islam, who is the man that has been sent to the Muslims and to the whole of mankind, and what is the religion, these 3 questions he can answer. So obviously in the qabr, the non-Muslim will not be the same as the Muslim. So it's not just about mental information. It's not just about knowledge, about answering the question. In the qabr, the answer to the 3 questions will be about your condition. Your condition will answer. If you have lived this life, Rabbak Allah, then you will say that my Lord is Allah in the qabr. If you have lived that your Islam is everything, in the qabr you will say my religion is Islam. If you have followed Sayyid al-Khalq sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in his teachings and his path, then in your qabr, in your grave, you'll be able to say that the man that has been sent to me is Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad. So already we're making a separation between what is Aqidah and what is Iman. Let's now talk about what is not Iman. And the Quran itself teaches us this. And it's amazing, subhanAllah, that everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, or demands that we do, we have the answers in the Quran and the Sunnah on how to do it. And the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes even a step further. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even warns us about the way it should not be done. So when I say if I ask someone to do something, it will be mercy from me to explain in detail how to do it. But it will be more mercy from me to spend even more time with this brother explaining how it should not happen. So make sure you don't fall into this. This is how it should be, and make sure you don't fall into this because this is wrong. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have the greater example. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us all of this in the Quran. Not only what to do, but what not to do as well. Let's start with the first verse so we can assess what is not Iman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَقُولُ آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَبِالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَمَا هُمْ بِمُؤْمِنِينَ. So Iman is not just something that you say. Because according to this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and there are some people who say, we believe in Allah, and we believe in the last day, but they do not believe. So clearly the belief is not something in the mouth. And unfortunately in the Muslim world today, this is probably one of the biggest issues that Muslims fall into. Where they seem to think that Iman is just by saying I'm a believer. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept what you think Iman is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only accepts what He demanded what Iman is. And there's a big difference between the two. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will leave you to say as much as you want. He'll leave you to say, I'm a believer, I'm a believer, I'm a believer. He'll leave you to say it. No problem. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will impose upon you the test that He believes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala believes, is the way to demonstrate whether you are a true believer or not. حَسِبَ النَّاسِ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ. Do people think that they'll be left alone to say I'm a believer, but they will not be tested? And then the verse goes on to say, and we have tested the ones before you, so that Allah may know those of you who are sincere, those of you who are true believers, and those of you who are not. Simple. So instead of living our life thinking Iman is what we think it is, and when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings the test, not only to prove that Iman, but to elevate our status in this world and the hereafter, and to clear our sins as well, but we fall into the issue where we keep on thinking that Iman is what I think it is, especially when we haven't picked up a book and we haven't read the Aqidah. I'm not just talking about simple words of Aqidah. Read 1 or 2 or 3 books about Aqidah. So Allah tests you so that you can see in front of your own eyes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows whether you're a believer or not. But He puts you through the test so you can see with your own eyes. So that may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect every brother and sister in this masjid and everywhere else. If you don't pass the test, you see with your own eyes that you did not pass the test. Why did you not pass the test? Because you're not a believer. Why are you not a believer? Because the belief that you thought it was is different to the belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala demanded it be. So there's no injustice. Because that test that you went through, you should have been able to pass it if you were a believer. But the fact that you didn't pass it is because you're not a believer. You can say from here till next year, I'm a believer, makes no difference to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We follow the way that Allah has established for us. And the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not only has He established the way that we should be believing, but He has sent a prophet for 23 years to show us how to do it as well. See how many levels of mercy we're getting to already? So no one has excuses on the Day of Judgment. And no one has excuses in their qabr. No one has excuses. So this is the first example where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that Iman is not just something that you mention with your tongue. But Iman is something in the heart and proven by the tongue. I'm not saying that we're excluding what comes out of your mouth. But first it starts inside yourself, and what is said by your tongue is a confirmation of your state of Iman. But when you don't have the state of Iman and you start saying it, and it's just coming out abstract, not arising from deep Iman inside you, then there's a problem. Then that can't be Iman. The second thing, Iman is not just about doing your rituals. The salah, the fasting, the hajj, the Umrah, the Zakah. It's not just about that. Obviously we all know this is part of Islam. But what I mean by that, or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes to us, is just because you get up and pray and fast and do Umrah, etc., that is not proof that you're a believer. Even though obviously as a believer you have to pray and fast. But if someone doesn't have the belief in their heart, and they're just getting up and praying and fasting and doing the rituals, that's not enough Iman. That's not a proof that it's Iman. Because Islam is not about movement. Islam is about true spirit and true belief in the heart. This is why, brothers, I can understand when I see a brother in the Kaaba. I can't remember if it was Umrah or Hajj. He was around the Kaaba doing tawaf, and he's on his mobile phone speaking to someone. Why? Because to him, it's about the movement. It's about the movement of the salah. It's about the movement to go and give my zakat to the charity. And it's about movement doing the Umrah and the Hajj. So fine. So no one can blame him. He thinks. Because he's doing the movement. So he thinks that I could be on my mobile while doing the movement and doing the tawaf. I can open my iPad, or I can be on roller skates. I'm still doing the movement as far as he's concerned. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that don't think that just by doing the movements, or doing the salah, or doing the rituals, that this is a sign of you being a believer. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna al-munafiqeen, talking about the hypocrites. Why? What is the understanding of a hypocrite? What is the definition of a hypocrite? What's inside is different to what's outside. That's a simple understanding of a hypocrite. What's inside is the opposite of what's outside. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and I'll just say the translation straight away for the coming verses because of the time, inshallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the hypocrites try to deceive Allah. They try to deceive Allah. But it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who causes them to be deceived. This is the Surah An-Nisa. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who causes them to be deceived. When they stand up and pray, وَإِذَا قَامُوا إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ, when they stand up and pray, so they're doing the movement already. So there should be no problem, they think. So when they stand up and pray, they do so in laziness. And they do it showing off. So that people can see that they're standing up and praying. So, this is an example that just because you get up and pray is not a state of Iman. It's not a confirmation of Iman. But Iman has to start by inside. Because the munafiqeen, they do the exact actions as we do. Inshallah, we don't have any munafiqeen here at all. May Allah protect us. But this is a confirmation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if you think Iman is just about getting up and doing the movement, the hypocrite does the same movements as you. He might actually do the movements better than you. Yeah? He may be able to stand up and not move more than we move. Yeah? He may really concentrate on the salah more better than us. But he's not doing it for the sake of Allah. So even though it's not to do with movements, he may be doing the movements better than us. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that it's not about the movements. Another example Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives in Surah An-Naml. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسَهُمْ ظُلْمًا وَعُلُوًّا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that those people, and this is the example, that it's not just mental information in your mind. Not because you know about Allah and you've read a few books about Allah, then you're a believer. No. This next example in Surah An-Naml says to us that true Iman is not just about the information in your mind. Even if it's about the greatest thing ever, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, followed by the Prophet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا. They denied it. We're talking about the non-Muslims, the kuffar. And this is the stories of the histories of Islam in the Quran. They denied it. They denied it. So their actions denied the truth. وَاسْتَيْقَنَتَ أَنفُسَهُمْ. Even though their souls affirmed this information. So their mind and their soul affirmed it, confirmed that there is Allah. So they have the information, they have the knowledge. Yes, they're convinced, they know there is Allah. But they still turned away from the truth. So can we consider these being believers, being mu'mineen, just because they have the understanding and they're convinced that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one? Not the number one, but one as in being unique? Again, another example from the Quran that it's not just about the mental knowledge. And this now brings us to the topic of the aqidah that we were talking about earlier on. Aqidah, and that we can now say what is Iman. The relationship between Iman and Aqidah is that Aqidah gives you the knowledge which convinces you and teaches you and makes you understand the religion, understand Allah, understand the Prophet, and understand the ghaybiyat, the unseen. So Aqidah gives you this knowledge, and you will be convinced with this knowledge. Once you're convinced with your knowledge, then that has to translate into Iman. How does it translate into Iman? That you start putting it into practice. That it changes you. It doesn't just stop as you being convinced, but it changes you to become a different person based on this piece of information, based on this knowledge. And we'll give a very quick example of one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Aqidah is something, knowledge, and the Iman is something as a result of this knowledge. So the submission that comes after the knowledge. So you're convinced, then afterwards you're submitted to this knowledge. So when we say anything to do with Aqidah, that there is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then this is knowledge. But then it has to translate into submission to Allah in the way that you submit and worship Allah, so it becomes Iman. So that's the relationship between the two. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives an example, and He says, no way can it be the case for a believer, and this is given an example of the condition of Iman. So once you've got past the knowledge side, this is the condition that you should be if you become a true believer, if you are a true believer. And one thing I want to say, which is very important about believers, because a lot of people think that becoming a believer is about getting to a certain level and stopping. So I do worship and I do submission, I do istighfar maybe at a young age, and I continue in that way. Then I get to a certain level where my worship is good, and I stop there. I continue the way that I am. This is not Iman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, and this is amazing how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us just through two words, that Iman is a process that you go through until the moment that you die. So you're always in a state of purifying yourself, always a state of becoming even better. If ever you think that your worship is good, you start it to go down. Because you should not look at your worship, you should look at who you're worshipping. And if we're looking at who we're worshipping, then any worship that we do until the last moment that we die will never be enough for the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if ever you think that your Iman or your religion or your practicing is good, you start it to go downwards. Be careful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us an example that it cannot be the case of a believer. This is one example of being a true believer. It cannot be the case of a believer that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the messenger have decided a ruling that you claim exercise or you claim freedom of choice. You claim freedom of choice. And we see this a lot in the West. You say to someone, Ya akhi, this is haram. He says, but Ya akhi, this is haram. You know, come on, it's haram. Yes, but we're living in the West. It's haram, yes, but I'm not living in Saudi Arabia. You see? That's not a true believer. Because a true believer, when he hears that there's a ruling from Allah, he has no option whatsoever. He completely submits to this ruling and he follows it the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala demands. The second example from the Quran, which comes in Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, by your Lord, so this is an oath from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ, by your Lord, they will not be true believers until they seek your teachings, the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, in all matters, everything. Again, no choice for myself. I go and I submit to everything to do with the Quran and the Sunnah. By your Lord, they will not be true believers until they seek your teachings in all matters on which they disagree. So everything, and especially as well when you have a disagreement with someone, you go back to the Quran and Sunnah. And if the Quran and Sunnah says that you're wrong, you submit and you follow the Quran and the Sunnah, even though you wanted something different, which they disagree. And they do not find the least upset in their heart. Because sometimes you can tell someone this is haram, you can't do it. So they'll stop doing it, but in their heart they'll feel, oh, I really wanted to do it. That's not true Iman. Iman is that you have the least upset, you have no upset in your heart. You submit to what the Prophet says and Allah says, and you're extremely happy that you found the truth, you found the haqq. And they accept it with submission. So there's two parts in this ayah. One, they do it with total comfort and total happiness, and they submit to it. This is what true Iman is about. This is the standards that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed for Iman, not the standards that anyone may think that He has in his mind, especially the kind of standards and the kind of impressions that we have in the way that brothers and sisters have been brought up. Unfortunately, some brothers and sisters have taken the Quran and Sunnah to be their upbringing. Their upbringing. So the way that I was brought up to practice my religion is my Quran and Sunnah. I'm going to do it that way. And that's dangerous. Because if it was about upbringing, then it wouldn't be fair for the non-Muslims outside. It wouldn't be fair for the non-Muslims outside that we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give hidayah to absolutely everyone outside. But if it was about the upbringing, then it wouldn't be fair for a young child to be brought up in a non-Muslim family and continues to be in a non-Muslim family. Why? Just because his parents weren't Muslim. But we're the lucky ones because our parents were Muslims, so they brought us up. No, it doesn't work like that. That's why scholars say that even if you were brought up as a Muslim, you have to testify. You have to testify at least once in your life, Ashhadu anna la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. So it's coming from you. It's not something that you've just inherited from your family. You believe it and you submit and you accept Islam, even though you're brought up as a Muslim. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم أدعو الله وأنتم موقنون بالإجابة لعلها تكون ساعة إجابة بإذن الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. Dear brothers and sisters, we'll inshallah conclude with an example, one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this name is absolutely amazing, just as all the other names, but the way it was presented in one of the surahs that we all know, Surah An-Nas, the way that it was put into that surah, okay, gives it much importance. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَلِكِ النَّاسِ إِلَهِ النَّاسِ. So, the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Malik, is one example I want to give inshallah in just 2 minutes. But we want to relate it to what we spoke about. We want to relate it to the Iman, the definitions of Iman that we just spoke about. And the way that the two elements, that we accept this with a kind heart and a comfort heart, and we submit to it as well. Basically, in summary, the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Malik, is about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that's ultimately in charge of everything. So we have, for example, Rabb al-Nas, Malik al-Nas, Ilahi al-Nas. Rabb al-Nas, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created and the one that gave rizq. And then we have Ilahi al-Nas, which is the one that we worship. Allah, Ilah, meaning the only one that should be worshipped. In the middle of the two verses we have Malik al-Nas. And the importance of Al-Malik is that if you start with the first one and say that I believe and I submit totally that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created, and I submit the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives the rizq, so that's قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ, that's the Rabb. If you do not submit to the second one, Malik al-Nas, then you'll not be able to get the third one, Ilahi al-Nas. You'll not be able to worship Allah properly. That's why it's put in a sequence. Rabb, Malik, Ilah. Rabb, He's the one that created and gave us rizq. Malik, He's the one that has total control and total possession of everything. Ilah. If you get the first two ones right, you will easily submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And your worship and iman will be at great high level. Now the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Malik, which means that He has ultimate ownership, absolute ownership. He has the ownership. And He owns every single thing in this world is a possession of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we, the possession and the leadership that we have in this world as human beings is metaphorical. It's not real. The real ownership is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, just think for a moment, obviously we don't have time to go into the name and describe it even more in depth. But if you just think about that name alone, and you deal with that name that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has total ownership, and you look at the two conditions that we mentioned in the last verse, that I have to accept this with comfort in my heart, and I submit to it. I accept it with comfort, so when I deal with my wife at home, for example, I know that I have ownership in the house, but it's not absolute ownership. So this will then make it easy for you to listen to the verses of Allah and put it into practice. Why? Because you know that even though you're the leader in the house, even though there's consultation with the wife, etc., but you're the man, the leader in the house, you always know that you don't have true leadership. It's metaphorical leadership. It's temporary leadership. It's limited leadership. Why? Because you don't own anything. You don't possess anything in its true sense. It all truly belongs to Allah. So when you know that your wife, for example, that you're a leader in the house, and there's leadership above your leadership, which is the leadership, the true leadership of Allah, you know that anything that you need to know, or anything that you need in order to practice in that house in the right way, once you listen to a view which is different to your opinion, you'll be able to submit it straight away. But if you don't get the name right, and it doesn't have a deep effect, a mental effect and a psychological effect, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the true leader, and the leaderships that you have is not true, is not absolute. If you don't get that right, then you're not going to be able to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala properly. And I'll give you an example. You could be, for example, an owner of a company. You could be an owner of a company, but you don't manage it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses everything, and Allah's in charge of everything. So Allah governs this world that we live in, manages the world that we live in. But we don't do both. We can't do both. Even though they're both limited, but we can't do both together. For example, you're a manager in a company. You own a company, but you have a manager because you can't manage it, for example. Then you're in a state where you can be a leader, you can be an owner, but you can't be a leader. You can be a manager, but not the owner of the company. So you can be a leader, but you can't be an owner. Let's say, for example, you purchase your houses, for example. You purchase your houses for halal means. So you're the owner of the house, and you're the leader of the house. But you get a letter from the council saying that we're going to build a runway. So you have to get out of the house. Yes, they'll give you another house. But can you claim that I really have ownership of this house? No. You may have thought so, you may have deceived yourself, but it wasn't absolute ownership. Because only true possession and leadership and ownership belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the way that we should be dealing with things in terms of the knowledge, in terms of the aqidah, and this is the way it should have an effect on our condition so that we become true Muslims. I invite every single brother and sister, inshallah, to contemplate on this and to focus on the true understanding of Iman. What should it be? And there is no better source that we can get the understanding of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants more than we can get it from the very words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And more than we can get it from the very Prophet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent. So let's go back and revise our Iman and remember the verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and this proves to us that the Iman is a process until you die. It's not like a race. You get to the finishing line and that's it. It's something that you constantly, you might drop, you might do a bad thing, you get up again, you do istighfar. You continue, you have good days, you try to get better days, you go back a bit, you continue. It's a strive. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَالَّذِينَ جَحَدُوا وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Those who strive in the way of Allah will be given hidayah, will be given guidance. So don't ever think that we're going to be guided without strife, without jihad. Mujahada means that you're being firm against your desires, you're being firm against the shaitan. وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. جَاهَدُوا سُبُلَنَا. That's how we should understand the Quran. This is the result of this. This leads to this. If you want to get to this, without this, then you can continue crying for the rest of your life, you're not going to get it. And you can claim that you're a believer for the rest of your life, you're not going to be. وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Those who have strived for the way of Allah shall get the guidance. And finally, those who may think that Iman is just something that you get to and then you stop, it's a process that you constantly strive. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says some beautiful words in the Quran that makes us think. I used to think that Iman is fine the way I am. I'm practicing, I'm praying, I'm fasting. Just continue like this. I used to think this is Iman. Listen to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Jalla Sha'nu says. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Oh, you believers, believe." Subhanallah. And we're thinking that khalas, that's it, I got to the level of belief, I'm a believer. No. First of all, never think that you're a true believer. Because whenever you think, like we said earlier, whenever you start to think that you're in a good state and you're excellent and wonderful, you're going to go down. But this verse tells us that, oh, you who believes, continue to believe. So it's a process, it's something that you continue doing until you die. The only time you're going to relax is inshallah for every single one in this room and every single one in the sister's room. The only time you're going to relax inshallah when you say Rabbi Allah ديني الإسلام نبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. نسأل الله تبارك وتعالى كما جمعنا في هذا الجمع الطيب أن يجعلنا من أهل قوله تعالى وسيق الذين اتقوا ربهم إلى الجنة زمرا. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He guides us to His path. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He purifies our heart. اللهم انصر الإسلام وأعز المسلمين. اللهم انصر إخواننا المجاهدين والمستضعفين في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم ثبت أقدامهم. اللهم وحد كلمتهم. اللهم سدد رميهم يا رب العالمين. اللهم طهر قلوبنا. اللهم نور قلوبنا. اللهم اجعلنا من الصالحين ولا تكلنا إلى أنفسنا طرفة عين. اللهم انصر المستضعفين في كل مكان يا رب العالمين. اللهم اجعلنا لك مؤمنين لك صالحين يا رب العالمين. نسألك في هذا اليوم الكريم في هذه الساعة المباركة أن لا تقبض أرواحنا يا رب العالمين إلا وأنت راض عنا ونحن على كامل الإيمان والاستسلام لك يا رب العالمين. نسألك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام أن تقبلنا مؤمنين صالحين وأن تبعثنا مؤمنين صالحين وأن تدخلنا جنتك جنة الرحيم مع النبيين والصديقين والشهداء وحسن أولئك رفيقا. جزاكم الله خيرا والحمد لله رب العالمين. ونذكركم there is inshallah tomorrow there is a lecture in the masjid by Dr. Abu Anas and it's about happiness in Islam. So tomorrow inshallah in the masjid after al-Maghrib and the lecture is about happiness in Islam by Dr. Anas. وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين